February 26th, 1959. A search team stands frozen in the Ural Mountains, staring at something that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The tent has been slashed open from the inside, not cut to escape an attacker, slashed by people desperate to get out into a Siberian winter where temperatures plummet to minus 30 degrees Celsius, where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where survival without proper clothing is measured in heartbeats. 9 sets of footprints lead away into the darkness. Some are barefoot, some in socks, some in a single boot. The tent still contains everything they would need to survive: warm clothes, food, boots, a working stove. Their supplies sit untouched, neatly arranged, as if they'd simply stepped out for a moment. But these experienced hikers, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, never came back. What could make 9 people, all skilled winter mountaineers, choose certain death over staying in their shelter? 10 days earlier, the group was in high spirits as they began their trek on February 1st. This was supposed to be a prestigious expedition, a challenging winter journey that would earn them the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering. They were the best of the best: engineering students, athletes, war veterans. The Ural Polytechnic Institute had sent their finest. There were supposed to be 10 of them, but Yuri Yudin turned back on the second day. A flare-up of joint pain forced him to abandon the trek. He would be the only survivor, not because he escaped whatever happened on the mountain, but because he was never there. Before he left, he took photographs of his friends. They're smiling, confident, playing in the snow. In one photo, Igor Dyatlov grins at the camera, his whole life ahead of him. In another, Zina Kolmogorova strikes a playful pose. These images would become evidence in one of history's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries. The group's planned route would take them across the frozen landscape to a Torton mountain. They documented everything meticulously. Dyatlov kept detailed journals, and several members carried cameras. They expected to send a telegram from the village of Vijay by February 12th. That telegram never came. When the group failed to return by February 20th, their families demanded action. Rescue teams and student volunteers fanned out across the mountains. On February 26th, they found the tent on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, a name that translates from the indigenous Mansi language as Dead Mountain. What they discovered defied explanation. The tent was still partially standing, weighted down by snow, but torn open from within by knife cuts made in frantic, desperate slashes. Inside, the searchers found boots neatly lined up, warm clothing carefully folded, personal diaries and cameras, money, documents, everything except the hikers themselves. Outside, the footprints told a story that made no sense. 8 or 9 sets of tracks. The falling snow had obscured them in places, leading downhill toward the tree line about 1.5 miles away. The prints showed that most of the hikers were in socks or barefoot. A few had 1 boot. They were walking, not running, proceeding in an orderly fashion, as if in a trance, as if something had called them into the darkness. The search team followed the footprints through the deep snow, their own unease growing with each step. When they reached the forest edge, they found the first bodies. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko were found beneath a towering cedar tree, frozen to death, wearing only their underwear. Between them were the remains of a small fire. They had tried to warm themselves. But here's what made the investigators' blood run cold. The cedar tree's branches had been broken off up to 15 feet high. Someone had climbed up there in the freezing darkness, breaking branches. But why? What were they looking at? What were they hiding from? The bodies showed strange details. Their hands were burned. Pieces of skin from their hands were found embedded in the tree bark, as if they'd clawed at it desperately. And then there was the clothing, or lack of it. 3 more bodies were discovered along the path between the cedar and the tent, as if they'd been trying to make it back. Zina Komagorova was found 2,000 feet from the tent. Rustam Slobodin was discovered 1,000 feet from the tent. Igor Dyatlov's body was found closest to the tent, just 1,000 feet away. They had died of hypothermia, one by one, as they tried to crawl back to shelter. But they were wearing clothes that had been cut from the bodies at the cedar tree. Zina wore Yuri Krivonishenko's pants. Why would dying people strip the dead and don warm clothing, only to die anyway so close to their tent? 5 bodies found, 4 still missing. It took 2 more months to find them. In May, after the snow began to melt, searchers discovered the final 4 bodies in a ravine 250 feet from the cedar tree. They were better dressed than the others, wearing multiple layers of clothing, much of it cut from those who had died first. But these bodies told a darker story. Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. Her chest had been fractured with such force that experts compared it to the impact of a high-speed car crash. No external wounds. The force had come from within, or from a massive pressure. Alexander Zolotaryov had similar massive chest fractures, 5 ribs broken. Nikolai Thibault Brignot's skull was fractured. These were not injuries from a fall or a fight. The medical examiner stated the force required was far beyond what a human could deliver. Yet there were no external wounds, no soft tissue damage around the injuries. It was as if they had been subjected to extreme pressure, like a shockwave. 3 of the 4 bodies in the ravine were found lying on a bed of carefully arranged clothing, as if their companions had tried to make them comfortable before they too succumbed. The Soviet investigators declared it a compelling natural force and closed the case. The files were sealed.
What happened on Dead Mountain? The theories have multiplied over the decades, each trying to explain the inexplicable pattern of evidence. Avalanche? But the tent was still standing. The slope wasn't steep enough. Expert mountaineers would have known the danger. Infrasound? Some scientists propose that wind across the mountain created low-frequency sound waves that induced panic and irrational behavior. But why did they proceed so calmly down the slope? Military test? The area was relatively close to military installations. Some witnesses reported seeing orange spheres in the sky around that time. Could a weapons test have gone wrong? The chest injuries resembled blast trauma, but there was no burning, no shrapnel. Paradoxical undressing? In late stages of hypothermia, victims sometimes feel hot and remove their clothing. But this doesn't explain why they left the tent in the first place, or the severe internal injuries. Attack? The Mansi people were initially suspected, but were ruled out. They had no motive and no history of violence. Besides, the footprints showed the hikers leaving the tent on their own. Every explanation fails somewhere. The evidence refuses to fit into any single narrative. Here are the facts that any theory must account for. 9 experienced winter hikers cut their way out of their tent in the middle of a February night in Siberia and walked away, in their socks and underwear, leaving behind everything they needed to survive. They proceeded calmly down the slope, walking, not running. They built a fire. They climbed a tree. They carefully removed clothing from the dead to dress the living. 4 of them sustained massive internal injuries consistent with extreme trauma, yet they survived long enough to walk to a ravine and arrange bedding for the injured. 1 was missing her tongue and eyes. And then they all died, within a mile and a half of shelter and safety. The Soviet government classified the area as forbidden for 3 years after the incident. When researchers finally gained access to the files in the 1990s, they found radiation detected on some of the clothing. Not enough to kill, but enough to be noted. Perhaps the most haunting detail of all, when the search team found the tent, before they noticed it was cut from the inside, before they followed the footprints to the bodies, they found something else. Dinner was still laid out. A meal, half prepared, as if they'd been interrupted mid-task. Whatever happened on Dead Mountain, It happened fast enough that experienced mountaineers abandoned a meal, but slowly enough that they cut their way out methodically and walked, not ran, into the killing cold. They weren't fleeing in blind panic. They were leaving deliberately.